around Europe.
Saving souls requires fierce devotion, unswerving belief,
The Lord comes first.
and a passion for what's right.
All sinners gonna go to their end.
But what happens when the preacher questions her own faith?
How am I gonna preach when I can't even pray?
Find out in Amen Corner, our play of the week on the 29th of May on the BBC World Service.
This is the BBC in Vancouver.
This is the BBC in Belgrade.
This is the BBC in Singapore.
This is the BBC in Kigali.
This is the BBC in New York.
Wherever you are, however you listen, this is the BBC.
BBC World Service. This is Judy Swallow with Newshour. Hundreds of Iraqi prisoners released from Abu Ghraib, but more graphic evidence of the abuse scandal is exposed in Washington. Israeli forces pull out of Rafah. We hear about the devastation they leave behind and ask what happens to those left with nothing. Also, on the beat in Liberia, we meet the Los Angeles policemen struggling to find good cops on the war-torn streets of Monrovia.
They don't have uniforms. I have to ask them, are you a police officer? Because I can't tell. They're in a T-shirt. But what they have is desire.
And why tall people have it all. First today, we'll have a full bulletin of the world news.
BBC News with Rachel Weston. Hundreds of Iraqis are being released from the Abu Ghraib prison near Baghdad. In recent weeks, the jail has been at the center of disclosures of abuse by American guards. Reporting from Baghdad, Dunita Luthra.
6 buses pulled out to the confines of the now infamous Abu Ghraib jail, the start of another round of prisoner release. 472 inmates are to be freed through the day. It's part of a move to reduce the prison population and improve conditions following the scandal that's caused international outrage. There are around 3,500 Iraqis detained in Abu Ghraib. Most haven't been charged with any offense. And it's believed a significant number are being held for criminal offenses rather than anti-coalition activities. Now the U.S. military is trying to halve that number. Last week, almost 300 were freed.
Meanwhile, new disclosures of prisoner abuse at Abu Ghraib have been published in the United States. They include an image of a naked prisoner apparently smeared in excrement and allegations that detainees were forced to eat pork and drink alcohol in contravention of their Muslim beliefs. The last Spanish soldiers in Iraq are leaving the country, fulfilling an election pledge made by the new Spanish government to withdraw its forces. The final contingent has left its base in the southern town of Diwania and is heading for the border with Kuwait. Spain originally sent some 1,400 troops to serve with the US-led coalition in Iraq. Israeli forces have partially withdrawn from 2 areas of Rafah in the Gaza Strip, which they've occupied over the past few days. Dozens of homes have been demolished, and the departing troops have left residents furious at the destruction they've caused. Our correspondent Alan Johnston reports from Rafah.
A large olive orchard has been destroyed. There's not a tree left standing. Every street around it has been churned up by the tanks. And many buildings have been damaged by the heavy armor as it's maneuvered up and down the roads. Israel says that it only demolishes a home when it's convinced that it's been used by militants. But a medical worker called Subhi insists that he's mystified as to why the bulldozers came for his father's home in the middle of the night. Subhi says there was no warning. He only had minutes to rescue his father, who's in his 90s.
There's been international condemnation of the Israeli actions in Rafah. The European Commissioner for External Relations, Chris Patton, expressed concern over its effect on the population.
What worries me is how much more difficult this is going to make it to persuade Palestinians in the street to turn their backs on the people who advocate violence and advocate appalling suicide bombing.
The cricket authorities in Zimbabwe have called off a test series against Australia that was due to start in Harare on Saturday. The Zimbabwean team had been seriously weakened after 15 white players went on strike in a protest over their side's selection process. They accused the selectors of rushing inexperienced black players onto the team for political reasons. Zimbabwe's cricket union has a policy of promoting black players to reflect the country's population. You're listening to the news from the BBC in London. At least one person has been killed and about 50 others injured in a bomb explosion at a Muslim shrine in the town of Sylhet in Bangladesh. The injured include the British High Commissioner, Anwar Chaudhry, who was hurt in both legs and taken to hospital. His condition is described as not serious. Police say they think a bomb was thrown by someone in the crowd. Roland Burke reports from Dakar.
Mr. Chaudhry took up his post only last week. He's been the subject of intense media attention because he was born in the region of Sylhet and emigrated to Britain as a child. The shrine where the bombing happened has been targeted before. In January, an explosion during a religious ceremony that involved dancing killed 3 people. No one was arrested, but Islamic extremists have been widely blamed.
Some news just in. Football's world governing body, FIFA, has lifted a penalty imposed on the Cameroon national team for breaking the rules on clothing at this year's African Cup of Nations. 6 points were to be deducted when the team began its qualifying round for the 2006 World Cup for wearing one-piece bodysuits at the tournament instead of regulation separate shorts and shirts. But the president of FIFA, Sepp Blatter, had proposed that the penalty be lifted as an act of grace. Officials at the Nepalese Ministry of Tourism say a Sherpa, Pemba Dorji, has broken the record for climbing Mount Everest. Pemba reported that he'd reached the 8,800-metre summit only 8 hours and 10 minutes after leaving base camp, which is 3,500 metres lower. Pemba held the Everest record for 3 days last year before it was broken by another Sherpa, Lapta Gelu. BBC News.
You're listening to the BBC World Service. I'm Judy Swallow, and this is Newshour. Americans woke up today to more horrific disclosures about the treatment of Iraqi prisoners by U.S. soldiers. The Washington Post newspaper published more pictures of torment and humiliation, along with documents describing that abuse. Prisoners telling how they were sexually fondled and forced to eat food from toilets. With the scandal escalating in Washington, in Baghdad, hundreds more inmates were released today from the notorious Abu Ghraib jail to an ecstatic welcome. Well, Paul Peachy is an AFP journalist in Iraq. He joins us from a coalition base just outside Baghdad, where some of the prisoners were dropped off earlier today. Paul Peachy, describe for us what happened there.
Well, we had 3 buses pull up here at one of the bases just only a few miles away from Abu Ghraib prison. We had about 60 of the former detainees getting off the bus. These were 60 of a group of 109 that were all due to be dropped off in and around Baghdad. And we saw them waving from the windows of their bus as they came out. Then they lined up in a few rows outside the base here before they were allowed to go home and complaining bitterly about the treatment they received.
What did they tell you about what happened inside the prison? Were they explicit about that treatment?
None of them said they'd witnessed any torture. None of them said they'd been beaten, like we heard in the case this week of Jeremy Sivits, the one man that's gone on court-martial for what happened at Abu Ghraib. But they did complain of restrictions on their behaviour, showers being stopped without any need. One prisoner said that he was forced to lay down outside on the ground in the sun for 5 to 6 hours. Another one said that guards of the prison had put their feet over his head and were getting forced to lie on the ground.
What were the conditions of their release? Did they know? I mean, did they know why they were chosen?
Well, they didn't even know why they were picked up, so they remained, some of them 10 months, 11 months after their detention, mystified as to why they believe they'd been picked up. Of course, some of them were told that they were arrested for possession of illegal weapons. One was told he was accused of being a member of the Fedayeen, but many of them said they didn't have a clue. Some of them said they suspected that they'd been ratted on by friends and picked up without due cause. Of course, we won't.
Among those who met them, were there any people there trying to make political points?
No, what we had here with the Americans in this area here
Abu Ghraib is a scene of some of the worst fighting here after the insurgency started in April. They've now settled down and spoken to tribal chiefs. They tried to make a pact with tribal chiefs for them to sign for these people and agree not to cause violence in the future, whether or not, obviously many of them denying they weren't behind it in the first place. But, so they were agreed by the tribal chiefs who had great sway over the area before they were allowed to go home to meet their families.
Paul Peachy of the French news agency AFP, just outside Baghdad. Thanks for joining us. Well, the scandal over the treatment of prisoners at Abu Ghraib exploded largely because of a report by the International Committee of the Red Cross, leaked almost certainly deliberately. But its shocking disclosures raised many more questions and concerns about the treatment of other prisoners held by the U.S. authorities in secret locations. The ICRC has no access to al-Qaeda suspects. It doesn't even know where they are or how many there are. And it is worried. Our reporter John Manell has been trying to find out where the detainees are. Men like the senior al-Qaeda figure, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed.
American and Pakistani authorities struck a serious blow to al-Qaeda by arresting Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the man who masterminded the September the 11th attacks, is no longer a problem.
One of the most wanted al-Qaeda fugitives is arrested in Pakistan.
It was a major scalp. Arrested last year, the so-called al-Qaeda chief of operations. His name still appears on the FBI's list of the most wanted terrorists.
Conspiracy to kill nationals of the United States. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed should be considered armed and dangerous.
But he's the only one of the 22 most wanted whose picture is accompanied by the word located. The question now is, where is he? The Pakistani authorities have told me after they'd interrogated him, he was handed over to the Americans. But his whereabouts now are a mystery. A U.S. government official told me KSM, as she called him, is in, quote, an undisclosed location. We also don't know where a number of others who have been described as high-level al-Qaeda suspects are being held.
As you know, the ICRC is visiting Guantanamo, is visiting Bagram, and has not come across those persons during the course of its visits.
The International Committee of the Red Cross first publicly expressed concerns about those being held in undisclosed locations 4 months ago, after its president met Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice in Washington. But Francois Stamm, who's the ICRC's head of operations for North America and much of Europe, has told today that the organization still hasn't received any information on these prisoners and is becoming increasingly worried.
We simply do not know. I mean, this is maybe why we are very concerned. We don't know. As I told you, we don't know how many persons we are talking about. We don't know how exactly they have been arrested. It has been made public for some of them, maybe not for all of them. The fact of not knowing anything about the detention of those persons is a great source of concern.
Trying to find out where they may or may not be isn't easy. I spoke to Major Michael Shavers, spokesman for legal issues at the U.S. Department of Defense at the Pentagon.
There are 3 locations that the United States has acknowledged holding detainees: Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, Afghanistan, and in Iraq.
Does that mean other facilities don't actually exist, or that simply you don't have the information on them?
I only have information on those 3 locations.
So is there a possibility that there could be other locations about which you don't have the details?
There's been speculation of other locations, but those are the 3 which we have acknowledged holding detainees.
He said it might be worth trying some of the other departments. So I did. First, the State Department.
We're not the ones doing the detaining.
Then the National Security Council at the White House.
We do not and would not comment on those matters. Those are intelligence matters. I refer you to the appropriate intelligence agencies.
What about the Department of Justice?
No comment.
And the FBI? After all, he's on their website.
I can't tell you that. It's a security issue.
And the CIA wasn't able to give me any official comment. So I turned to Vincent Canestraro, a former head of counter-terrorism operations at the CIA.
It's clear that the information about the location of where the high-value al-Qaeda suspects are being held is very closely guarded. We had heard earlier that at least as a way station on the way to an ultimate holding area, they were brought to Diego Garcia, but that's such a remote place that probably would have served only for initial debriefing. I certainly think as an initial holding area where they're trying to disorient the person, such as Khalid Sheikh Mohammed or Abu Zubaydah, they may very well have been taken there because it's an ideal place to isolate someone and to cut him off from all sources of information.
This isn't the first time that it's been suggested that Diego Garcia may have been used, and it would be significant as the island in the Indian Ocean is a British overseas territory. It's used as an American defense facility under an agreement signed in the 60s. In London, a Foreign Office spokesman told me,
"The U.S. authorities have repeatedly assured us that reports that any suspected terrorists or Iraqi prisoners are, or have been, held or interrogated on the island or in any vessel anchored there are unfounded."
Wherever they may be, organizations like Amnesty International are concerned about how they're being treated. The New York Times has alleged that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed has been subjected to an interrogation technique known as waterboarding, in which a prisoner is strapped down, forcibly pushed underwater, and made to believe he might drown. The International Committee of the Red Cross says its negotiations to see these men are ongoing, but it's still waiting for a positive response to its request.
Tom now reporting. So what do you think? Should Al-Qaeda suspects enjoy the protection of the Geneva Conventions and the International Committee of the Red Cross? Or is the United States justified in keeping their location secret? Newshour at bbc.co.uk to have your say. That's Newshour at bbc.co.uk. It is the BBC broadcasting from London, and let's move on now to the political turmoil in Baghdad, sparked by the raid on the offices of Ahmed Chalabi, a member of the Iraqi Governing Council, and hitherto, arguably, its most powerful member. He was America's favorite, touted by the Pentagon as the future leader, but the raid was carried out by the U.S. as well as Iraqi officials just days after Mr. Chalabi's funds were cut off by the Pentagon. Mr. Chalabi says he knows why he was targeted.
Yesterday's raid happened because of my positions that I've been pushing for complete sovereignty in the past month. It's time for the U.S. to let the Iraqi people have sovereignty and to get a government that will have complete independence and control over the country. We want to be friends of the United States, and we want to ask for security assistance.
Mr. Chalabi may have his theories, but more than 24 hours after the raid on the office, the circumstances remain largely a mystery. Who ordered the raid and why? What was removed to aid what investigation? Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld said he knew nothing about the raid, if indeed there was one. So much for any conspiracy theory about the Pentagon publicly abandoning its protege. With me in the studio is Semi Ramadani, a writer on Iraqi affairs and senior lecturer at Metropolitan University. Semi Ramadani, first of all, the Governing Council is meeting an emergency session to work out its response to this raid. Are they rallying around Mr. Chalabi?
Three of the members issued a statement yesterday expressing strong support for him and criticizing the coalition authorities, occupation authorities for the raid. And they also expressed their own personal vulnerability that if he is being treated that way, then any other member of the IGC might be treated in a similar way. And they were calling on the IGC as a body to condemn what has happened and to call for an investigation.
What is going on with the Governing Council? Are they jockeying for power, or trying to consolidate their positions, hoping they will be the next leadership? Is this raid part of that?
Well, the raid itself has to be looked at separately from the IGC in general. The IGC in general is a totally spent force within Iraq. It's a discredited body with no real powers. There are influential figures within it because they have militias or they have certain power or certain forces within the country. But as a body, it is totally discredited and has been for a long time now seen as a tool for the occupation, a fig leaf really for justifying the occupation. But the raid on Mr. Chalabi's house and the center of his political operation within the Iraqi National Congress,
significant, and as much as you introduced the program, he was a close friend of the United States and a very close friend of the Pentagon.
Well, certainly, but you've heard there that Donald Rumsfeld has said, I know nothing about this raid, even if there was a raid, it has nothing to do with the Pentagon. Then who?
I don't think the Pentagon would have raided him. I think one has to look at the CIA and the State Department there, because for a long time now, Chalabi has been a strong friend of the Pentagon. Wolfowitz, the deputy to Rumsfeld himself, all this neocon group had been very close to Chalabi and his advisors. So the fact that they disowned him effectively, Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld disowned Chalabi a few days ago, and they announced that they are going to no longer fund him.
So you say it's
the writing was on the wall.
Power struggle in Washington as well?
I think it's partly that, certainly.
Sami Ramadani, thanks very much for joining us. Well, while various Iraqi politicians and groups have the power and influence in Baghdad, time is rapidly running out. By June the 30th, it should be clear who will replace the governing council when sovereignty is supposed to be handed back to Iraqis from the U.S.-led occupiers. It should also have been decided by then how much power they'll wield, if any, over security and oil money. The UN, in the person of Special Envoy Lakhdar Brahimi, is charged with answering those questions. On the line is Salim Malone, who was spokesman for Sergio Vieira de Mello. He was, of course, the UN's top man in Iraq, tragically killed in a bomb attack on their headquarters in Baghdad last year. Salim Malone, thanks for joining us. Is the key here the wording of any UN resolution?
Well, I think we are making far too much of this UN resolution. On the whole, what I see is Mr. Brahimi, who is a very, very brilliant Arab and has done wonders in other places of crisis, is trying to find some kind of consensus amongst those he is meeting. And he's not been able to meet, certainly, many, many people and many, many friends of thought in Iraq. And that consensus only has limited value because the legitimacy that everyone thinks will flow from a Security Council resolution, I mean, that's a very naive hope.
But isn't the idea of having a UN resolution to draw a line under the occupation to make clear that there is some transfer of sovereignty? Because the fear among the other members at the UN, particularly those on the Security Council, is that this is just going to be a search, that no real power hands to the Iraqis.
I mean, in fact, I think that is what is going to happen anyway. What the other member states are doing is trying to preserve the credibility of the Council and to soften somehow the notion that there is no power whatsoever in the new government that's going to be established. But the reality is that these member states, France, Russia, Germany, they do not want to have a fight with the U.S. They will try to snipe at the edges. They will try to push the U.S. as much as they can. And I also do want to say that whatever government, so to speak, is established will be a big step forward from the governing council that we have now. That I do not want to deny. But on the whole, I don't believe the Americans can afford to have a genuinely representative government in place soon.
On the other hand, if the occupation continues as it is at the moment, isn't that an even more dangerous situation?
Well, look, so I'm not saying that this should continue as it is. This is a step forward. What I'm saying is, it is not a dramatic step forward. It is not going to change the situation, meaning that the insurgents are suddenly going to stop attacking on 30 June. Indeed, the Americans, President Bush himself, who has so far been saying this is going to be a terrible period between now and June 30, yesterday said, even after June 30, it's going to be a very severe challenge to us. So you don't see a light at the end of the tunnel unless the U.S. changes its policy. It's not up to the Security Council, really. It is up to the U.S. to see that it's failing. Its policies are failing. This is a disaster for the U.S. itself and for everyone else, Iraq, I mean. And they need to move more quickly, the U.S. itself, to hold elections and to hand over power.
Salim Malone, thanks very much for joining us. Salim Malone, former spokesman for the UN in Iraq. You're tuned to the BBC World Service, broadcasting from London. Now on to lighter issues, and there's a very lofty gathering in Switzerland this week, literally. It brought together all the clubs of tall people in Europe. Presumably they didn't meet to commiserate, but to celebrate their lucky lives, because academics, psychologists, and economists alike agree that tall people are much more successful than short ones. Our economics editor, Evan Davis, has been trying to find out why.
If you long had the suspicion that your tall colleagues somehow get on better than you, you may not be paranoid. Academic evidence has long supported the finding that size does matter. In particular, tall people have elevated salaries. Among white British men, an extra inch of height is associated with a 2.2% increase in wages. On the average salary, that means add an inch to your height, add £500 a year to your income. If you want more anecdotal evidence, incidentally, look at American elections. In 10 out of the last 13 contests, the taller candidate has won. George W. Bush was one of the exceptions. Now, all of that has tempted people to say this is simply discrimination. Apartheid, you might say. Ho-ho. But discrimination can be a complicated thing, and a recent paper from the University of Pennsylvania found some interesting light on why tall people earn more. First off, rule out one obvious reason, that the tall tend to have all sorts of advantages in wealth, health, and diet. The academics have thought of that and controlled for it, and allowing for that, the tall get paid more. Maybe employers have an aesthetic taste for tall people. Maybe evolution encouraged us to hang out with the tall, who presumably had a selection advantage in hunting bison. All modern employers want good bison hunters, don't they? But in fact, the evidence suggests it's not that. It's not a taste for tall mates, it says, and indeed, discrimination in favour of the tall is different to discrimination on racial or gender grounds. How come? Well, you see, your skin colour tends to remain pretty constant over your life. But your relative height actually changes. You can be a tall teenager and an average adult, or an average teenager and a tall adult. By studying the data very carefully, the Pennsylvania guys have found that what matters most is not your adult height, it's your teenage height. In other words, tall adults usually get paid more because they were tall teenagers. Now, the researchers surmise that teen height could matter because of some kind of teenage confidence boost it gives. Taller teens take part in more sport, for example. That helps them develop social and labour market skills. But perhaps, just to show how far economists can go in putting a price on everything and a value on nothing, there's one more interesting finding in the Pennsylvania study. They look at whether it's worth undergoing hormone growth therapy as a child to secure a better salary as an adult. Yes, they find if you're going to earn a lot, the therapy is worth paying thousands of dollars for. In my day, it was just a pair of platform shoes you got. Far cheaper.
Our economic editor, Evan Davis. You're tall as average height, which I am as well, but I'm taller than Manuel Zaragoza, so I must be rich. Manuel is here, by the way, to tell us about business and the fact that it's make or break time for Mitsubishi, but the financially troubled Japanese car maker says it's secured $4 billion in emergency rescue funds to buy this business. It's announced it'll cut almost a third of its global workforce. The company's chief executive says this is the company's last chance for survival. So, Manuela, is this going to work?
Well, there's a lot of damage to repair for Mitsubishi. It's lost a lot of customer loyalty in the US. Its cars are not selling there. They're losing money. There's been a series of scandals where it's had to recall cars. So there's a lot to sort out. The key question people are asking about Mitsubishi is this. Daimler Chrysler, a German car company, which is a shareholder in Mitsubishi Motors, they've said recently that they thought the Japanese car company needed about $8 billion to sort out its situation, the mess it's in. So, $4 billion, is that really going to be enough? That's what people are asking now.
Well, lots of other questions as well. How did it get into this mess? Is it the right package to get it out of it?
Well, it has huge debt, $9 billion worth of debt. Its car sales are plunging. It's had problems with its models because of a series of recalls. It suffered a loss of credibility as a result of that in the eyes of many customers. The final blow really came from Daimler Chrysler, which, as one of Mitsubishi Motors' main shareholders, said recently that it wouldn't sink any more money into the company. And really, the fact that it's just given up on it after 4 years of being involved with Mitsubishi Motors is just not much of a vote of confidence.
So where did the money come from?
Well, the money's going to come from Mitsubishi Motors' parent company, the Mitsubishi Group, and also from U.S. investment bank J.P. Morgan Chase, which is giving shares in return for putting money in the company. I hope the gamble pays off. What's the market making it all? Well, earlier Tokyo's Nikkei was up 1.9% at 11,017. London up 0.2%, 44.39. The dollar's currently buying 112 Japanese yen, euro $1.20.3 US cents. Manuela Saragossa out to buy a pair of platform shoes. Oh, well, news summary, folks. We're coming up for you shortly on the BBC World Service.
A kiss of serene beauty, or sublime peacefulness. Shattered. Programmed Operation Bluestone. In 1984, the Golden Temple in Amritsar, the holiest shrine of the Sikhs, was stormed by the Indian Armed Forces.
This is the place where a lot of dead bodies were piled up, and these very white marble have blood-stained acid that has just been spilled from them.
A justified act to flush out militants, or a heinous defilement of a sacred site. The BBC's Mark Tully looks back at the events which were a turning point in Sikh history.
In this series, we set out to explain how such an incredible thing happened, and then to examine what impact that has had on the Sikh community, not just the
After Bluestone starts Monday at 2, 7, and 13 hours GMT on the BBC World Service.
Still to come on Newshour, rebuilding lives and homes in Rafah. Can it be done? We hear from Kampala, where Africa's finance ministers come up with a plan to boost trade. Will they follow their own advice? And turning lawless rebels into good cops, can an LA policeman perform a miracle in Liberia?
First, we'll have a summary of the latest world news.
Through an olive grove which had been completely destroyed. An old man next to it on the bench broke down as he told me what had happened. There were just two dazed-looking women sitting in the middle of the destroyed olive grove. And then on Nile Street, I walked down. There was no tarmac, just rubble, mounds and mounds of earth and rubble. And down each side of the street, armoured tanks had sheared off the shop fronts in a number of places. I came across several smashed houses, completely demolished. Around the corner there was gutter strips, only zoo had been completely destroyed, and monkeys had escaped, and I understand that even a kangaroo somewhere on the loose in Rafah at the moment.
You describe people sitting in the rubble of their homes in tears. We've seen pictures of school children likewise sitting on the rubble of their homes, on the rubble of their school. What happens at night? Do they have places to go to?
One thing that's important to keep this in a degree of context is that last week when the Israelis came, they razed quite a few streets and dozens of homes went. And what we see now there is not on anything like that scale. As I say, you walk down 4-5 streets and you see 6, 7, 8 houses that have been demolished. And the Israelis would say that they do that because they're convinced that there's some kind of militant activity going on there. Of course, I came across a man who said that the house that had been demolished was his 95-year-old wheelchair-bound father. He said he was absolutely in no way any kind of militant, so they'd lost the house at midnight. He'd have to run in and grab his father as the house was being bulldozed.
Alan Johnson in Rafah, thank you. Well, like most Palestinian towns, Rafah is part private property, part refugee camp. The majority of Palestinians in Gaza are registered as refugees, and it's the UN agency UNRWA that's responsible for them. Its deputy director in Gaza is Christian Nordahl. They're trying to... Now, Christian Nordahl, do you have the money, the material to rebuild lives, rebuild homes in Rafah?
As the situation stands just now, we have enough weapon material in Gaza to provide the urgent emergency relief that is required, which is tents, blankets, mattresses, and food. We have also opened up now schools in Rafah where we receive homeless people During the last 3 days, we have registered 450 persons as being homeless. In the longer term, we need to provide new shelters for the refugees, and unfortunately for that, we have not got the funds that is required. We are approximately $32 million short for that.
The thing is, when we talk about refugees, people might think that they were living in tents, but of course they weren't. These were very permanent settlements, have been there, many of them, for 50 years. That is actually rebuilding entire apartment blocks, whole housing estates, isn't it?
That's correct, yes. We have to remember that the refugee crisis started more than 50 years ago, and at that time the people were moved into tents. Later on, it was possible to build houses, and now they are losing the houses and moving back to tents again.
What happens though to those who are not actually refugees? Because it's almost a sort of bureaucratic nicety in Gaza. So many are refugees, but that is just a case of where their families originated from. What happens to those in Rafah who are not registered with you?
Well, to start with, about 3/4 of the population are refugees, and they are being assisted by us directly. In an emergency situation as we have now, with the emergency aid that we are giving them directly after house demolition, we do not segregate between who is a refugee and who is a non-refugee. It's only the long-term assistance where that is segregated, and it's the Palestinian Authority who are looking after the non-refugees.
The thing is, the Israelis have made clear they want to have a security zone along the Egyptian border. Have you discussed with them where you might rebuild? Because it would seem pointless rebuilding where they might want to destroy the homes again.
Yeah, we haven't discussed in detail with the Israeli authorities. We have rather discussed with the Palestinian authorities where it is possible to get land for rebuilding shelters, land where we consider the area to be safe enough to venture into.
Mr. Analogue of the UN's Refugee Agency in Gaza, thanks for joining us. You turn to the BBC World Service broadcasting from London. Now, why is Africa so poor? Or you could turn that question around and ask, is it possible for Africa's poor to get richer? The answer in the Ugandan capital Kampala today is yes, through trade. Africans must be able to sell more of what they produce domestically, also to their neighboring countries, and to the rich nations of the world. So the question is how? How to overcome all the barriers at home and abroad to free, fair trade? Let's hear the problem first from some farmers in Kenya, who told me about the obstacles they faced doing business.
I, as a farmer in Bungoma, am so much disadvantaged because on the side of procurement of fertilizer and seeds, you find that the prices are very high and you market at very low prices.
When we grow tomatoes, we don't sell them in kilos. We sell them in boxes. That is where farmers lost a lot of money because a box may take 6 or 8 kilos.
I'm a coffee grower. We brought a lot of coffee and sold to the coffee board. Yet the small-scale farmer whose coffee was taken has not been paid.
So let's hear those answers in that gathering in Kampala, which brings together the continent's finance ministers to discuss how to use Africa's collective clout to get a bigger share of world trade. At the moment, by the way, the entire continent accounts for less than 2% of world trade. The conference is organised by the UN Economic Commission for Africa. Its executive secretary is K.Y. Amwako. We've brought him together with Africa analyst Richard Dunn, but Mr. Amwako first. His rallying call to the meeting was, do more to maximize the benefits of trade. So how?
There are two sides to the coin. One is what we need to do to get the trading partners to open up market access, to remove our cultural subsidies, and match many of the issues that are on the WTO agenda. Domestically, Africa also needs to do quite a bit to take advantages of the opportunities in world trade, including removing infrastructural bottlenecks, including trade facilitation.
Well, we'll look at the international markets in a moment, but can we first talk about these domestic bottlenecks. What exactly are you talking about? What do African nations need to do to increase inter-Africa trade?
Well, inter-Africa trade is very important. Right now, as you know, inter-Africa trade is just about 10% of our total trade. So that's very much on the low side. I think the regional integration agenda that we've been pursuing is critical. The free trade areas, the customs union agreements, the intra-Africa transportation bottlenecks need to be removed to improve inter-Africa trade.
Well, let's bring in Richard Dowd now. Richard, I presume that you've been listening to what was said there by Mr. Mwako and saying, yes, here, here, but I've heard it all before.
Indeed, there is a class in almost every African country that makes its money off stopping people at borders and checking their things and taxing them, and that's how many of them get their own salary. Us who travel a lot in Africa call it a personalized VAT system. And it is, whatever the governments at a very senior level say, it's very difficult to stop these people. And every border post is crammed with them, and they do take quite a heavy toll on anybody who tries to move goods across borders.
Mr. Mwako, there you are. The charge is your key problem is corruption. Do you accept that?
Well, I think delays are customs are a major trade barrier. Clearly, so customs processing is hampered by information customs law, unnecessary inspection of cargo, and corruption. I think all these are factors. And that's why I said some of the things we need to be domesticated to address this very much as a field.
Richard Dowd, let's look at the question of world trade and Africa's parlous record of access to international markets. I mean, this huge continent accounts for 1.9% of world trade. Where does the guilt lie principally? Is it mean international markets, the European Union and the US, putting up trade barriers?
There's no one simple answer to that. I mean, the factor that we haven't mentioned is several African countries are landlocked. The continent has more landlocked countries than any other part of the world. So you have to cross several countries to reach the ones in the middle of Africa. Lack of infrastructure to move goods around. So I think there are a lot of internal problems that even African governments can't do much about. The continuing trade barriers in the rest of the world to goods produced in Africa, those are factors. But if you compare what has happened in Africa to, say, a country like Vietnam that was completely destroyed 20 years ago, and how far they've come forward just in a few years, you realize that facing the same difficulties, a country like Vietnam has gone ahead in leaps and bounds. So you do have to look really at the internal factors in Africa more.
Mr. Mwako, how would you define, in quotes, the African disease, that they seem so incapable of having any clout on the international stage to prize open markets? Developing nations flex their muscles at Cancun, but African nations seem to have gone home and nothing's happened.
At the last Cancun meeting, you have to agree that African governments and African leadership is, for the first time, really came together very well. And I think Africa's voice was heard. But I agree, we are disadvantaged when it comes to negotiations. If you take, for example, Geneva, sometimes the US or the UK or some of these things have about 40, 50 negotiators. And many African countries can't even afford one. So collective positioning on the part of African countries is important.
Richard, do you agree with that Africa needs collective action? It's interesting you use the Vietnam model. You don't talk about Indochina acting together. People don't talk about all of South Africa acting together, but they don't talk about all of Africa acting together. I mean, couldn't it be the case that sort of the bad apple rots the rest of the barrel?
That's a question of perception, I think, that you talk to many businessmen and you talk about Africa and immediately they start talking about Zimbabwe, as though the whole of Africa is like Zimbabwe. I mean, I think that's the fault both of other Africans failing to sell the very positive things that are happening, but also the failure of outsiders to recognize that Zimbabwe is a medium-sized country in southern Africa and there are, 51 other African countries that aren't like that. I think that's largely a question of perception. It is true that at the London and Paris clubs where debts are dealt with, all the debtors gang up together against one little African country, but the idea that African countries could come as a group and talk about debt is always an absolute no-no. The creditors won't allow that.
South Africa, Richard Dowd, and you also have the Executive Secretary of the UN Economic Commission for Africa.
KY Amyoko speaking to us from Kampala. If there were a league table of failed states in Africa, Liberia would be pretty close to the top or the bottom, depending on how you look at it. The form was completely lawless for generations. This time last year, it was wrecked by civil war, which was just the latest battle in what seems a relentless cycle of violence. But this time, the world didn't look away. Peace was restored. President Taylor dispatched into exile, and now a massive UN peacekeeping force has been deployed, and Liberia is taking the first big step to becoming a normal functioning state. It started recruiting a police force. Our correspondent Mark Dawes, who's covered the successive wars in Liberia, reports on the efforts to rebuild the peace.
In January of this year, a former senior officer in the Los Angeles Police Department, or LAPD, Mark Croker, had just arrived in Liberia and was weighing up the challenge of being the country's new United Nations Police Commissioner.
It is an impression of the most destitute, impoverished, and abandoned police agency I have ever seen in the world, and I have seen hundreds of them in many countries.
A man from the LAPD doesn't mince his words.
We're starting from just nothing, coupled with rampant residual corruption that is still there. We know that it's there. So we found an agency that is desperate.
This is a message from the Public Information Section of the United Nations Mission in Liberia.
This month, the United Nations has begun recruiting 3,500 new police officers.
Guidelines for the candidates. Who can apply or such candidates?
Criteria for applicants are sometimes surprising and reflect the sad history of Liberia.
Must not be the subject of any investigation of war crimes, crimes against humanity, or any crime that violates international human rights conventions.
Back at the beginning of the year, I drove with Croker through the looted, bullet-scarred streets of Monrovia.
What's the major problem here in your area?
In my area, there are criminal robbery. For 2-3 days.
Well, we're pushing to have more police out here. You know that the Liberia National Police has 3 cars. We got a whole 14 years of war, and I've been here 3 months, and we got a long ways to go. Okay? You're welcome.
As we drove along, I asked Croker what sort of people he was looking for in his new force.
Fundamental questions. You want to put people in jail? You want the action? No, it's okay. Young people have this desire, but the thing that you look for is, do they really care about people? Police officer's day begins with compassion and it ends with service. If you don't have well, you don't deserve to be a police officer.
Crime, electricity shortages, corruption. Liberia is truly starting from zero. But in all the despair, a human touch reveals some hope.
Are you a police officer? Yes, sir. My name is Mark Croker. I'm the police commissioner.
How much money?
I have heard that this police station is operating very well, and you've got good things and good people working hard. So I wanted to stop by and say thank you for a good job.
Now, Commissioner, it does seem as though the police here have got almost nothing.
They've got zero syndrome, as I identified it. But what they have is desire. You can see it in their eyes. They want to be a functioning police agency. They want to operate. They don't have uniforms. I have to ask them, are you a police officer? Because I can't tell. They're wearing a T-shirt.
Now, you say that they have the desire to do well. But most Liberians that you talk to, when you say, what about the police? They go, those police, they just asking for money off us all the time. They're dishonest, etc. I mean, that's the average perception. Now, your perception seems to be at odds. Are you naive, or are you just putting the best spin on things?
No, I'm not disagreeing with them, because that is so. There is much corruption, and there are abusive police officers. But here is a little pocket of well-meaning people who are acting in the way that we want and expect them to. And they somehow need someone to tell them it's okay to be nice.
So, 5 months later, with the new recruitment drive underway, an update. I went back to Commissioner Croker and asked him if Liberian policemen had got the message. Were they being nicer? As I
think the police are being nicer and kinder to the population, and the population are responding to police concerns and police calls for mobilization and community participation.
Now, the last time we spoke, the Liberian police force only had 3 cars. And how are some of those resource constraints being changed?
Those resource constraints remain, and those 3 cars are still out there, plying the streets of Monrovia. But there have been no additional assets granted to the Liberian National Police by the transitional government. The money has not yet arrived in the trust fund so that we can expend it on the police development package.
It doesn't sound like very good news, Commissioner. I mean, if they're still 6 months into, since you really started working, there's still only 3 police cars, and the government's not giving the backing that you think it should to this whole process.
You know, at times it can be overwhelmingly discouraging as we see the assets problem just looming.
But why is the government not giving you the support that it needs? Because, I mean, the politicians in the government don't have any problem finding cars when they want to drive around in air-conditioned 4-wheel drives, do they? I mean, why can't they give some of those to the police?
The main problem continues to be a focus on the ministry leadership, and the ministry dollars seem to go like cream to the top, and very little goes to the working level of these ministries, including police, and where the needs are greatest, the money is less, and it's just not happening yet. It's a slow, long process, and we're holding on, but by a thread.
Holding on, Police Commissioner Mark Croker says, by a thread.
Liberia clearly needs a decent police force, but the challenges of creating one are formidable. Even with United Nations help, they're just holding on by a thread.
The man from the LAPD is learning how hard it is to make anything work in Liberia.
Mark 12, you should know. Mark 12 reporting from Liberia. You're listening to the BBC World Service, broadcasting from London. Let's go now to Bangladesh, where there's been a bomb attack at a Muslim shrine in the town of Sylhet. 2 people are reported killed. The British High Commissioner has been wounded. He and the other victims were treated by Dr. Abdus Salam.
Several people are injured, about 60 people. Meanwhile, about two men expired. And Mr. Anwar Chaudhry, British High Commissioner, he was slightly injured just below his right knee joint. And he was treated by our specialist officer. He has left the hospital for Dhaka with 2 ambulances and the police escort.
Well, with me in the studio is the head of our Bengali service, Abir Mustafa. So, first of all, what can you tell us about this attack?
Well, what we know so far is that the High Commissioner went to the shrine of Shah Jalal, who is a Sufi saint much revered all over Bangladesh. And as they were coming out after the Friday prayer, a bomb was thrown at his entourage. Now, it's not clear whether the bomb was targeted at him or in the general direction of the shrine. And also the police cannot confirm whether it was a homemade bomb or a grenade. Some police think it might have been a grenade, actually. And as you heard from the doctor, the casualties were not, inconsiderable.
This is the second time this shrine has been attacked this year, isn't it? How about the first attack?
Well, it's actually the 3rd time. The first time was in January when a bomb went off during a cultural event inside the shrine and 3 people were killed, and police have not solved that crime yet. And in March, somebody poisoned all the fish in a pond in the shrine, and these were not ordinary fishes. These fish are quite revered, actually. They have some kind of mythical status among the local population, and they're considered sacred, and all the fish were killed. Police suspect it's the same group, but again, they have not been able to arrest anyone or actually find out why they did it.
Are you talking about the same group? Is there some reason why certain groups would want to attack a Sufi shrine?
Yes, what the police are saying, that they suspect that it might have been one or 2 things, that these shrines are quite profitable ventures because people go and actually donate a lot of money. So police suspect there might have been some internal clash over the control of these finances. But more realistic assumption by the police is that there is a sect within the Islamic faith in Bangladesh who oppose any existence of shrines because they think that Islam prohibits idol worshipping, And when people go and pray at shrines where there are graves of saints or people who regarded by people as saints, that it is tantamount to idol worship. So police suspect that one of these groups may be targeting this shrine in order to drive people away from worshipping at the shrine.
Edward Rostov, the head of our Bengali service. Thanks for joining us. I'm Judy Swallow in London. You've been listening to Newshour from the BBC World Service. Newshour at bbc.co.uk.
BBC World Service, this is Ed Harry with the latest sport. The Zimbabwe Cricket Union has postponed their 2-test series against Australia, which was due to start on Saturday. The sides will still play 3 one-day internationals. The decision was made hours before the game's world governing body, the ICC, was due to meet to discuss whether the matches should be stripped of their test status. With the details, Joe Parsons.
Zimbabwe's test series with Australia had been in doubt since 15 Zimbabwe players, including the skipper Heath Street, boycotted the national team over the selection policies of the Zimbabwe Cricket Union. A much weakened Zimbabwe went on to lose all 5 one-day internationals against Sri Lanka and both test matches by an innings. That prompted concern that the integrity of the international game could be at risk if a second-string team took on the world champions Australia, and that triggered today's planned meeting of the ICC's Executive Committee. The Australians had earlier said they were unlikely to have played the 5-day games if they didn't have test status. The decision to cancel the series was taken by the ZCU after the head, Peter Chingoka, had met with Malcolm Brown from Cricket Australia in Harare.
Next to Lords and the second day of the first test between England and New Zealand. The tourists resumed on 284 for 5, but were all out this morning for 386 with a record-breaking innings from Chris Cairns, the highlight. For the details and news of England's reply, it's live to Lords and Chris Florence.
Well, first the news of the reply. England going well since lunch. They're 68 now without loss. Manchester Scottish 26 not out, and Andrew Strauss on his debut looking very confident indeed. He's 35 not out. As you say, they're an extraordinary first 70 minutes of the day. New Zealand's last 5 wickets adding 102, 82 of them coming from Chris Cairns from just 47 deliveries, 10 fours and 4 sixes in his innings, coming in just 62 minutes. The 33-year-old making what will probably be his last Test match appearance at Lords, really determined to go out with a bang. He did it the right possible way, and on his way he passed the world record of 85 Test match sixes, a record held by Viv Richards, and he made it 87 in his innings. Steve Harmison finishing with 4 wickets, 3 for Simon Jones, and New Zealand 386 all out. England though going well in their reply. They're 69 now without loss.
Football's world governing body FIFA has given back the 6 World Cup qualifying points they took away from Cameroon as a punishment for wearing an illegal one-piece kit. The original decision would have meant Cameroon starting their 2006 World Cup qualifying campaign on -6 points, making their participation in the finals doubtful. Cameroon broke FIFA's laws when they wore the kit at the African Cup of Nations in Tunisia earlier this year. They'll still have to pay a $157,000 fine, though. And briefly, FIFA have also agreed to accept the World Anti-Doping Agency's code of conduct. However, they will continue to impose their own punishments on footballers and not revert to the automatic 2-year ban.
Take the same occupation in 3 different countries. And the 6 works.
The 6 works?
The same problem. It's working street corners, and it makes you vulnerable, but different ways of coping.
Tell me on.
An insight into the lives of people who have the same job, but in different worlds. It's all in a day's work. It continues Wednesday at 2, 7 and 13 hours GMT on the BBC World Service. World news every half hour. This is the BBC.
It's 15 hours in Warsaw, 16 hours in Khartoum, 21 hours in Singapore, and wherever you are, you're very welcome to join us. This is the BBC World Service. Hello, I'm Charles Carroll, and at 13 hours GMT, these are the latest BBC News headlines. Hundreds of Iraqi detainees have been released from the Abu Ghraib prison near Baghdad after the disclosures of abuse by American guards. A Palestinians in Gaza have expressed their fury at the destruction of their neighborhood by the Israeli army as it withdraws from parts of the town of Rafah. The senior British diplomat in Bangladesh has been injured in a bomb attack on a Muslim shrine. And Zimbabwe's cricket authorities have cancelled their test series against Australia in a row over racially based selection policies. There's news on the internet at bbcnews.com. Do stay with us for a summary of all the latest international news.
BBC News with Peter Crawford. Hundreds of Iraqis are being released from the Abu Ghraib prison near Baghdad. In recent weeks, the jail has been at the center of disclosures of abuse by American guards. Reporting from Baghdad, Jamila Luthra.
472 inmates are to be freed through the day. It's part of a move to reduce the prison population and improve conditions following the scandal that's caused international outrage. There are around 3,500 Iraqis detained in Abu Ghraib. Most haven't been charged with any offense. And it's believed a significant number are being held for criminal offenses rather than anti-coalition activities. Now the US military is trying to halve that number.
Meanwhile, new disclosures of prisoner abuse at Abu Ghraib have been published in the United States. They include an image of a naked prisoner apparently smeared in excrement and allegations that detainees were forced to eat pork and drink alcohol in contravention of their Muslim beliefs. There have been renewed clashes in Najaf between American-led forces and militia of the radical Shiite preacher Muqtada al-Sadr. And in nearby Karbala, American tanks and helicopters pounded militia positions. The Americans say they killed 18 insurgents after rocket-propelled grenades were fired at American tanks. Muqtada al-Sadr, in his Friday sermon in Kufa, urged his supporters to fight on, even if they were killed or arrested. Mr. al-Sadr is wanted by the authorities in connection with the killing of another cleric. Israeli forces have partially withdrawn from two areas of Rafah in the Gaza Strip, which they've occupied over the past few days. Dozens of homes have been demolished, and the departing troops have left residents furious at the destruction they've caused. Our correspondent Alan Johnson reports from Rafah.
A large olive orchard has been destroyed. There's not a tree left standing. Every street around it has been churned up by the tanks, and many buildings have been damaged by the heavy armor as it's maneuvered up and down the roads. Israel says that it only demolishes a home when it's convinced that it's been used for incidents. But a medical worker called Subhi insists that he's mystified as to why the bulldozers came to his father's home in the middle of the night. Subhi says there was no warning. He only had minutes to rescue his father, who's in his 90s.
There's been international condemnation of the Israeli actions in Rafah. The European Commissioner for External Relations, Chris Patton, expressed concern over its effect on the population.
What worries me is how much more difficult this is going to make it to persuade Palestinians in the street to turn their backs on the people who advocate violence and advocate appalling suicide bombing.
A bomb attack at a Muslim shrine in Bangladesh has killed 2 people and injured about 25 others, including the British High Commissioner, Anwar Chaudhry, who was wounded in both legs. A similar bombing at the same shrine in the city of Sylhet in January resulted in the deaths of 3 people. The police have said they think the bomb was thrown by someone in the crowd. You're listening to the news from the BBC in London. A Russian government investigation has found that the remote Arctic region of Chukotka, governed by the billionaire businessman Roman Abramovich, is technically bankrupt with debts of more than $300 million, more than double its annual income.